Andrew Holmes, and it's my great privilege as the head of history at Queen's to welcome you all to the university and to the Keith Jeffery Annual Lecture in Public History. The lecture is organised as part of the annual conference run by the Centre for Public History under the leadership of Professor Alwyn Purdue. The Centre's engagement with the meaning and practice of public history is clearly evident in this year's conference on digital history in a divided world. The delivery of the excellent programme that you've all been enjoying has been the responsibility of my wonderful colleagues, and it's my pleasure to publicly thank at this point for all their hard work Maurice Casey, Alwyn Purdue, Emma Rice, Angela Rogan and Brian E. Wittes. And if you wouldn't mind actually giving them a round of applause. As with most things in academia, your reward will be in heaven. The first Keith Jeffery Annual Lecture in Public History was delivered in 2016 by Professor Margaret Macmillan of the University of Oxford. Since then, our guest lecturers have come from a variety of institutions, including the Smithsonian and the University of Michigan, and have addressed topics of enduring and contemporary significance. I want to extend a warm welcome to our lecturer for this year, Professor Julia Laite, who will shortly be introduced to you. The Keith Jeffery Lecture is named after a much loved and much respected colleague who died too young in February 2016. The phrase "a legend in his own lifetime" is overused, but in Keith's case it is applicable to an individual who was a first-rate historian, colleague, friend and family man. We're delighted that many of his family and friends have joined us this evening, including Sally, Ben, Alex and Hannah, Liz, Caroline, Janet and Joyce. You're all very welcome. Keith was born in Belfast and educated across the road at Methodist College. He then pursued undergraduate and postgraduate study at St John's College, Cambridge, where he also met Sally. In 1978, Keith began his career at the Ulster Polytechnic, which became a constituent part of the University of Ulster in 1985, before coming to Queen's as Professor of British History in 2005. His only misstep in his many years at Ulster University was to appoint me to my first academic job in 2002. Keith has a global reputation as a historian of the military, of Ireland and of the secret world of intelligence gathering. This is reflected in a range of books, including The British Army and the Crisis of Empire, A Military History of Ireland, co-edited with Tom Bartlett, Ireland and the Great War, which were originally given as the Lees Knowles Lectures at Trinity College, Cambridge, and Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, the political soldier. In 2005, he was commissioned by the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, to write an authorised history for the organisation's centenary. Keith was given unrestricted access to the files from its founding in 1909 through to 1949, an experience he likened to being let loose in a sweetie shop. The fruits of his research were published by Bloomsbury in 2010 as MI6, The History of the Secret Intelligence Service. His final book, published in 2015, was 1916, A Global History, which looked at how 12 events from different arenas of the war, including the Easter Rising in Ireland, reverberated around the world. During his career, he received numerous academic honours, including his election as member of the Royal Irish Academy and an honorary Doctor of Letters from the University of Cambridge. Keith loved his subject, and his engagement in public history was a natural outgrowth of his enthusiasm. He frequently addressed local history groups, professional bodies and student societies, as well as engaging with the media, including writing and presenting for the Australian television documentary Revealing Gallipoli. Given our obsession with impact, I well remember the glee our school manager Frances Mercer had when she reported on the number of media hits registered by Keith's History of MI6 that swamped by a ridiculous factor any other news emanating from the university. Yet to focus solely on academic contribution would be to miss the significance of Keith as a generous, entertaining, convivial and supportive teacher, colleague, friend and relative. Food and wine and conversation indelibly mark our memories of this wonderful individual who led a full life and allowed others to experience the same. For instance, he introduced MA students to white asparagus at a, and I quote, raucous anarchist pizzeria in Berlin. And much to the incredulity of Sally, he became a big game fishing champion in Bermuda. We very much miss Keith, but we are honoured that we have this lecture to remind us of his wonderful life and his contribution to our lives and to this university. I now invite my colleague Maurice Casey to introduce our Keith Jeffery Lecturer for 2024. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So firstly, just to echo Andrew's word of welcome and thanks as well to all of my co-organisers of the conference today. So my name is Maurice Casey, and just as a brief word of introduction, I'm a research fellow here at Queen's and one of the co-organisers of the conference. So I like to describe myself as a historian of the weirdly admirable and the admirably weird. And I think that any historian working today on those who existed on the margins of modern history owes a great intellectual debt to the work of our speaker this evening, Professor Julia Laite of Birkbeck, University of London, or Derry, London, to be ecumenical. Julia's expertise is wide-ranging, taking into its sweep the history of commercial sex and histories of migration, to histories of settler colonialism and her own ancestral story. Her work is defined by a virtuoso intermingling of approaches that seamlessly weaves together insights from public history, creative history, microhistory, digital history, and family history. So I first became a keen follower of Julia's work during my PhD after reading her article, The Emmett's Inch Small History in a Digital Age. And like a 1960s student Maoist, I instantly became evangelical about this article, reciting its insights to anyone who would listen to me, as though they were aphorisms inscribed in the Little Red Book. So that article remains for me, I think, the most insightful roadmap for how we keep in view the ordinary human story amid today's digital deluge of source material. Many, both within academia and beyond, will know Julia's work through her 2021 book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, which is a vivid recounting of one young woman's journey through the early 20th century circuits of commercial sex that becomes a masterfully told story of defiance and human agency. The book was a major influence on my own recent book, Hotel Lux, and shares with my book at least two things. One, a concern with how we find inventive ways of telling a story about forgotten people, and two, the fact that it is currently available in all good bookstores. Through her commitment to the relevance of the small, ordinary person in an era of big and often anonymous data, and her extensive experience in public history, I can think of no better person to deliver the Keith Jeffery Lecture at this year's conference. And so with that, I'd like to invite Professor Julia Laite to the stage to deliver her lecture, and invite you to join me in a chaotic round of applause.
Thank you so much, Maurice, for that wonderful introduction that I will try to live up to. And thank you for inviting me to speak. And I'll start with a caveat in that I am not a digital historian, so I'm already interloping. Though I, like all historians, have to daily reckon with the digital, and perhaps more than some historians, I spend no small amount of time thinking about it. I've never run a successful digital history project, but I've run unsuccessful ones. And so these are the thoughts of someone who's a user rather than a creator, for the most part, of digital history and digitized archives, which I hope will be worthwhile to those who would call themselves digital historians and those who don't. And so first I'm going to reflect really generally on some of the possibilities, concerns, and challenges that digital history and digitized data more generally brings with it, especially in light of the rapid changes in AI technology over the last few years. Then I'll reflect on how technology and the digital has changed the way some historians have worked and thought in the past, and how digitization shapes our research in the present. I'll compare my work on my new research project, which is on colonial and indigenous Newfoundland, in the digital era, with the work of a historian who made the subject her life's work and worked in the pre-digital era. And I'll finish by thinking about one of history's most perennial challenges that's perhaps more acute today than it ever has been, and that is how to deal with the sheer volume of material we have and how to account for the dizzying number of small stories that we now have access to from the chaotic past. So the fact that computers make it far quicker and easier to find and process large amounts of historical data can surely brook few arguments. Making at least some use of digital and computational resources for history has become the status quo for established researchers and students alike. It has, in Lara Putnam's words, become easy and quotidian. The developments over the past 10 years alone are dizzying. At least they are to me as somebody who remembers very, very well all the hullabaloo that was around when an archive catalog came out on CD-ROM. So a lot has changed since I was a baby historian. So digitized primary source material, books, pamphlets, periodicals now number in the billions. Ancestry.com, one of the biggest companies that digitizes historical records, adds 2 million new records to their digital repository every single day. And the digitization of sources, coupled with the new technologies with which to find, process, communicate, and understand them, is transforming the way that we do history and the kind of history we can do. And the first iteration of my thinking on the subject of digitization in history took the form of the article that Morris mentioned, The Emmett's Inch, Small History in a Digital Age. And its rather strange title is an homage to a line from William Blake's famous poem, Auguries of Innocence. And it says, the Emmett's Inch, the Eagle's Mile, make lame philosophy to smile. And it was intended, the title that is, as a challenge to the more oft-quoted line that opens that very famous poem, to see the world in a grain of sand. I'd started to grow annoyed about the overuse of that one line by microhistorians who I otherwise deeply admired. And as I went down the rabbit hole of discussions among microhistorians and their critics about which stories are representative and therefore which stories are worth telling, I got stuck thinking about how that Blake line, when used in this way, implies that small stories, the grains of sand, aren't important for their own sake, but only as examples or as avatars of something more significant, of a wider world. Instead, I argued in the article, what we might be better off thinking about is how we use digitized sources and tools to toggle between the large and the small, the eagle's view and the ant's view, that's what an Emmett is, and how these big stories and small stories fit together to become history. So digitization means that the deep contextualization that was once only possible for a handful of individuals who've left some kind of meaty trace behind can now be done for a huge number of other humble and ordinary people in the past. We catch more glimpses. We can see more traces. We find more clues. We don't have more information. The gone is still gone, but we have more access to that information. And the potential to be able to place individuals within the fuller context of their own lives is being dramatically improved every day. And that in turn calls into question whose lives, which grains of sand, get illuminated in this way, and how we might make a legible history from all these newly found small stories. And I'm going to return to this, not to answer it, but to ask it in a different way, I guess, at the end of the talk. So thanks to digital history, some publics are also encountering the chaos of the past in ways that they never have before. Snapshots of past lives, farm engagements on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Millions of social media pages are dedicated to local history, community history, and the enormous and ever-growing family history industry. And all of these contain millions of images and anecdotes about days gone by. And of course, there are too many excellent and accessible academic digital history projects and initiatives to even begin to name them here. And these digital projects and data sets are informing and aiding the research of millions of people daily. For some publics, digital history has catapulted them from a vague interest in their community or their family into intensive and long-term historical research. And I work with and teach many people like this, especially at Birkbeck, which specializes in adult education. And their insights are absolutely invaluable. But I do think that maybe this wellspring of history and historians on the web has not inherently produced a more historically literate society. But we can think about that together over wine. Historians, for the most part, are excited about the possibilities of digitization. but there are perils too. Even the most technophile writer on digital history often references the feeling of having a vertiginous number of sources at their fingertips. Mass digitization of printed material that means that even historians who work on time periods or places where there's relatively little information left or sources left find themselves asking, quote, what do you do with 1 million books? Individual researchers are daunted by their, quote, 10,000 digital note cards. They're lost in a sea of information, searching a digital haystack, dealing with gaps of excess, which is a term I really like, and with a compelling term coined by William Turkle, an infinite archive. As Daniel J. Cohen argued in the Journal of American History and in an interchange on digital history, quote, it is now quite clear that historians have to grapple with abundance, not scarcity. And so this excess is a problem as well as it is a boon. Lara Putnam articulates further concerns brilliantly in her article, The Transnational and the Text Searchable, Digital Sources and the Shadows They Cast. These shadows, she explains, lie in the way that inequality of resource, of attention, of data, of access is woven into the digitized sources that we use on a daily basis. And for my last book, I could discover a lot of information about Lydia Harvey, in part because she was Anglophone, she was white, and she was living in what we call the Western world, and because I am working in that world. The records of human social life now captured in the digitized world, writes Putnam, tells us so much about so much that we might forget to remember the systematic absences within them. New and even broader concerns about digitization and digital data have been added to the list since Putnam wrote that article in 2016, which doesn't seem very long ago, but many, many things have changed in sort of online since then. These are issues that affect everyone, not just historians, but which have particular consequences and resonances for those of us who work on the bits and the scraps that the past has left behind. First, there's the practical consideration of what we are actually, physically and strategically doing with the systems that store the information, as the ransomware attack on the British Library should have drove home to us all. As the partner of a system administrator for whom the BL crisis is a nightmare scenario, it definitely drove it home to me. Our data has been rendered exceptionally vulnerable to theft, destruction, and especially to manipulation in a way that I argue it has never been before. And it would be hubristic to assume that we would leave anything more behind 2,000 years from now than people who lived 2,000 years ago left for us, particularly as funding for archivists, including digital archivists, is slashed as part of a more general defunding of the humanities. We don't even know when the electronic legal deposit books from the BL will be made available again in full. We don't know if their data has been stolen, and we don't know if these books are currently being stripped and parsed by AI to train new AIs. We do know, on the other hand, that many historians' intellectual property is currently being used without recompense or acknowledgement to train neural networks, and that some journal publishers have fully admitted that they will be sharing materials with AI companies. We also know that the BL is only one of many, and it's just the beginning, not the end, of our data vulnerabilities. The practical and ethical problems have also become even more acute now that we are finally starting to realize the environmental costs of producing, storing, and sharing this data, which gets almost mind-blowingly bigger every day. That data centers alone, and this doesn't account for our personal computers or our personal storage, will account for over 2.5 to 3.7% of total carbon emissions by 2025. And to put this in context, the aviation industry produces 2.4. Data centers use almost 5% of the world's electricity, and they produce immense amounts of dangerous electronic waste, about 16% of which is salvaged in harmful ways in some of the world's poorest regions, while the rest goes on to become what tech anthropologist Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate calls immortal waste. Data centers are also water hungry. For example, the Utah data center alone, a facility of the US National Security Agency, needs 7 million gallons of water daily to operate. Meanwhile, the communities that surround it are running out of water. Data centers are also, oh, there's a mic, bad for bodies. And people who work there often report hypertension, anxiety, and other ailments stemming from what's popularly known as data center hum. And I've put this slide there because the propaganda from Google's data center is in marked contrast to what my partner says every day he gets home from a long day in the server room. And I think that when you think about this data as information, then these data workers can kind of become librarians in a library where everything is noisy and you don't get to read the books. And in this light, this precious historical evidence that I discover online, the conversations I have with colleagues over Teams, and the memes I share on WhatsApp appear significantly more hard-won than they have before. Like so many other sectors, we've outsourced our dirty work to invisibilized workers and have sped up our work without reckoning the costs of this for the planet. I know that historians are only a blip in this sea of information, but we're not negligible either. It is said, and I've tried many times to really authenticate this, but it's fairly convincing, the data. It's said that genealogy is the second biggest topic on the internet next to pornography. So it's not insignificant, this data that we're generating and the data that we're using. There's much more to be said about this, but I'll leave it there. And I wanted to open in this way because I think that these fundamentals really need to be on everyone's minds from the moment we begin to think about and use digital resources. And these questions of historical data and the technologies that parse and communicate it have become ethically and politically urgent for historians in yet another way. Now that we can suddenly make a computer sound and look like somebody long dead and put words in their mouths. We rather suddenly find ourselves caught in a world in which AI can reanimate the image of historical individuals and make them say and do things they never said or did. Sorry, I have to keep doing that. Where it offers initially convincing, if contextless, images from the past that are actually really tricky to differentiate from real images unless you're an expert in the area. The way that it produces images from prompts that recycle in often bizarro ways gendered and racial stereotypes, such as these images from a historian who was trying to get a rights-free image of Victorian prostitutes. And this is what AI thought that those women looked like. And I've actually got some theories for why they have vampire teeth. You can ask me about it in questions. AI also paints grotesque smiles on the faces of ancient indigenous people and First World War soldiers. Perhaps worst of all, and this is the bit that really bothers me, it claims to say that it enables you to chat with somebody from the past as though it's actually engaged in the act of necromancy, rather than just spouting anodyne facts mixed with hallucinations, which is the new word for lies. It's what AI calls lies. So generative AI and its particular relationship to the arts and humanities and to history specifically makes most of us deeply anxious for good reason. But it's not the first time we've been worried about claims that technology can help us deal with the chaos of the past and turn it into history. Lawrence Stone felt similarly, it seemed, about the way that new technologies were influencing and changing history back in the 1970s. Proving perhaps that historians make for terrible prophets, Stone wrote in his 1979 article, The Revival of Narrative, that, quote, "We all know of the doctoral dissertations which languish unfinished since the researcher has been unable to keep under intellectual control the sheer volume of printouts spewed out by the computer. One clear conclusion is surely that, whenever possible, sampling by hand is preferable and quicker than, and just as reliable as, running the whole universe through a machine." That was in 1979, so he obviously didn't have a crystal ball there. Stone was lampooning cliometrics, that is, a method that lay at the fringes of historiography in the 1970s, of using computer algorithms to analyze quantitative historical data. It has faded into historiographical obscurity in history departments, but not, it seems, in economics departments, where new neural networks are being designed to parse huge quantities of historical data to produce what creators claim are large-scale insights into the nature of past societies and systems. This is sometimes called culturenomics or culturomics, and now more recently is called cliodynamics. They keep changing the name. It all looks the same to me. And it's mostly the brainchild of evolutionary biologists, economists, and computer scientists. Historians find a great deal of this work risible, pointing out that not only was the data being used far from complete or reliable, but culturenomic or cliodynamic analyses usually offer no further insights into past societies than those witnessing that society did at the time. But that hasn't stopped a lot of tech and science people from using the data of the past to seek, as Tim Hitchcock critiques, a kind of key to all mythologies, the classic Casaubon delusion, as it is known. And even as most historians are critical of cliometrics or cliodynamics or culturenomics, confronting this new and accelerating abundance has nonetheless meant thinking big. So digitization, many historians feel, is a tool best used to service big history and the longue durée and the comprehensive. Quote, digital history and the abundance it tries to address makes many historical arguments seem anecdotal rather than comprehensive, commented Stephen Mintz in that same Journal of American History discussion. What is desperately needed, wrote Armitage and Gouldy in their provocative 2014 History Manifesto, quote, is a training capable of weaving data together into one interrelated fabric of time. So in revisiting Guidi's and Armitage's work, published 10 years ago, to prepare for this talk, I'm struck by the fact that they appear to presume that we want to weave data together into one interrelated fabric of time. That sounds to me like something that would be rather unbearable. It reminds me of the ultimate torture device designed by Douglas, or invented by Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, called the total perspective vortex, which gives the unfortunate person, person unfortunate enough to be condemned to it, a full sense of their precise scale and importance in relation to the universe. Everyone, save the infinitely important Zaphod Beeblebrox, of course, emerges with their brain totally and utterly fried. I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think humans understand things in this way. As the engagement farmers who now form the majority of social media can tell us, humans crave stories. And these stories are almost always about connections and relations, to be sure, but the last thing most of us want is an accurate portrayal of the one interrelated fabric of time. And this kind of thinking reminds me of another weird brush that historians have had with the world of technologies, math, and science. After cliometrics, but before culturenomics, history discovered chaos theory. So chaos theory had roots in the 19th century, but became a significant interdisciplinary branch of mathematics in the 1960s. It was a theory of finding patterns in apparently random systems, theorizing that systems which appeared random were in fact just hypersensitive to original or initial variables. If a butterfly flaps its wings in Japan, not only could this conceivably cause a weather change elsewhere in the world, but with chaos theory, we could track that effect. By the 1970s, these theories were being applied to biological research and medicine, and in 1979, the year I was born, thus beginning my small role in a chain of events that would see me standing here talking to you today, the term butterfly effect was added to the Oxford English Dictionary. But it wasn't until 1987, with the publication of James Gleick's best-selling Chaos, that the general public became truly enamored with this new way of understanding the interconnectedness of life and causation across space and time. And historians were among them, and it's easy to see why. I don't think we were among them in large numbers, but we were among them. Historians have always, to a greater or lesser extent, dealt with the sense of the past as a chaos in need of ordering. Carlyle called history, quote, the ever-living, ever-working chaos of being. And the very idea of seeing the world in a grain of sand, an eternity in an hour, is an expression of the theme that, according to Blake scholar Christine Gallant, runs through all of his works. That is, quote, the question of how chaos can be assimilated into imaginative order. So some of us were and are bound to be excited by new ways of thinking about and finding the patterns in the seemingly random past. But the late 1980s and the 1990s was also a specific historiographical moment that made chaos theory seem all the more promising. New histories of women, of the marginalized, of the colonized, of thought and feeling, of culture and everyday life were challenging political and social meta-narratives, while the rise of microhistory experimented with the consequential minutiae of unknown individuals and tiny towns. The challenge of postmodernism stripped away the last vestiges of the idea of Whiggish historical progress, and at the same time, Marxist historians were witnessing the fall of communism in the Eastern Bloc and the final death knell of deterministic history. As Carlo Ginzburg wrote in 1993, many historians were now understanding that, quote, reality is fundamentally discontinuous and heterogeneous. Challenging Western civilization's centrality in historical scholarship wasn't just a question of replacing one narrative with another, as we all, I think, know now, but of recognizing that the fundamental polycentric nature of world history made meta-narratives of any kind extremely difficult. So the use of chaos theory in history was seen as, by its proponents, as a way to recoup the meaning of history in a postmodern age. Like I said, not many of us, but some of us. Historical systems, while immense and polycentric, could actually still be modeled. They were chaotic and dynamic, not random and disordered. But yet again, like the historian's brush with cliometrics a decade earlier, this brief interest in chaos theory was deployed mostly in the name of thinking about big history and the longue durée. The small stories, the ones that we can now so much more easily find thanks to digitization, were understood only insofar as they, with this new understanding of chaos, were able to disrupt big stories. They were the initial variables that could have huge ramifications: the small butterfly, the large hurricane. And in the end, it was the ridiculous way that small stories played out in chaos theory history that would be its undoing, historiographically speaking. In a seminal article in which they accused chaos theory historians as having a scientistic illusion of understanding, Paul Roth and Thomas Reichman parodied the way in which, in chaos history, quote, any of an unbounded set of little people and little events could be brought into the story. If a kingdom was lost for want of a nail, then an account of the blacksmith's inattention, the bad meal that upset his stomach, his 2-year-old's dirty nappy, the distraction outside his shop at a crucial moment, all become causally relevant to the not too distant future state of the system. Obviously, if any detail, no matter how apparently picayune, has potential relevance in a causal account of what happened, then, short of divine omniscience, the claims of history to portray the past are just so much moonshine. But today, there are just as many historians who care about the dirty nappy as care about the outcome of the battle. We're not all out to discover why an empire rose or fell, and most importantly of all, I think, we know that even if it did, for the average blacksmith, his child's dirty nappy may well have had a greater impact on his day-to-day life than any massive change in administration. Blake would be on our side. A dog starved at his master's gate, he wrote, predicts the ruin of the state. In other words, for many historians, new technologies have not brought about any kind of major revolution in the kinds of questions that we ask or the methods that we use to answer them. Digitization is most commonly seen as a tool that is used to augment rather than to fundamentally change the nature of our research. So, in the second part of this talk, I'm going to change gears. And I want to think about my own research and how it's been changed and shaped by digitization in light of a pre-digital historian in whose footsteps I find myself walking. So I seem to have specialized in using both digital and non-digital methods to write the stories of obscure, humble, and marginalized women who've made very little mark on history. My most recent book, The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey, put many of the things that I talked about in The Immense Inch into action. And now I'm kind of trying it again with my new project about Shanadithit, who was a Beothic artist and rebel from the island we call Newfoundland. Newfoundland was England's earliest overseas colonial possession. Overseas colonial possession. I've even got it italicized up there to make it clear. Overseas, first overseas. From around the 1580s, it was informally settled by mostly poor and indentured people from England's West Country and Ireland's southeast. And over 400 years, British merchants extracted mind-blowing quantities of biomass from its shores and coastal waters. Newfoundland's salt cod fed the wealthy of Europe and was exchanged for wine and other luxuries. It's also fed the enslaved of the Caribbean, constituting up to 80% of the protein consumed on British plantations, and therefore massively enabling the production of sugar. It was, in short, one of empire's foundational commodities, if not the foundational commodity of empire. And this settlement of Newfoundland and its hyper-extraction was devastating for the Beothuk people, who today no longer exist as a culture. And it was in this context that Shenandoah, who is apocryphally known as the last of the Beothuk, bore witness to the death of her world in the early 19th century. And she died in June of 1829 of tuberculosis. So the book is mostly about her, or will be mostly about her. But alongside her story, I want to tell the histories of other Beothuk people who appear briefly in the colonial archives, including a young girl named Ubi, who was carried to Dorset after her family was massacred in Newfoundland in 1792. And here she seems to have disappeared from the historical record, but that's nothing like seems to have disappeared gets me going and searching more. Perhaps unexpectedly, Shenandoah actually has made a fairly profound mark on history with her own hands. Over the winter of 1829, she drew stories for her captors that told about her life, her kin, and her people. And these sources are digitized in multiple forms, and every iteration is differently useful. So there's these, which are kind of cleaned up, digitized versions that you can get on a library website. These sort of cleaned up versions convey what she was trying to say and the story she was trying to tell most clearly, especially to people such as, I'm assuming yourselves, who are really unfamiliar with her work and her life. So this is a sort of account of different water storage, of some cultural items, of somebody called the Red Indians Devil. So the Beothuk were known as the Red Indians. And yeah, I could talk a lot, as you might imagine, about all of these, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. These are maps she drew. They're kind of map stories that illustrate different experiences she had, including experiences of an intense colonial violence. And like I said, they're cleaned up and they're easy enough to read. But there's also high-res digital scans of the originals, which are much, much more difficult to read. You really have to puzzle through them. But they reveal important noise of the actual documents. And they also really reveal the interlocutions of a man named William Epps Cormack, whose handwriting appears on both versions. He's the man who rescued her or kidnapped her, depending on who you ask. And lastly, oh, sorry, I'll show you the maps because they're even more messy. So the red figures are the Beothuk and the gray figures are whites. She would always use red figures to draw her people. So lastly, there's encountering these texts in person as physical material objects. This encounter reveals their fragility and how faded Shenandoah's gray and red pencil marks are. They tell me that they were drawn on the pages of William Cormack's Merchant's Ledger book, which is something you can't really tell until you pick it up and you realize that it's the same paper as the ledger books that are in the archives. And it invites me to think about the texture of the page, the smell of the paper, and how the fluorescent lights of the museum storeroom, the random other artifacts that surround me as I'm researching them, they're always sort of pitched everywhere in museum storerooms, how all of that kind of affects my encounter and the way I read those documents. And it reminds me that the tactile and the real, the physically present thing, can evoke emotions and senses of connection. The paper that her arm touched, the marks of the pencil that her finger held, the stains and the wrinkles created by the document's journey through time. And lastly, there's the painful knowledge of how few of Shenandoah's pictures remain. She created many, many more that are completely gone, I think. Ask me again in about 10 years, and maybe I'll finally admit that they're gone. Either way, their absence is palpable, and it's an absence that I'm actively working with, and I think historians actively work with absence all the time, and I'm going to come back to that later. So I tell you all this by way of introducing you to the overall project, but also because it illustrates rather nicely how the digital can and must coexist with the non-digital, the gone with the not gone, and that it's only when we set it all together that we get a full picture of a source in the story that it's telling. So alongside Shenandoah's own drawings, the book will be built from a mixed methodology, from oral histories and folklore collected by a dilettante historian in the early 20th century, from scraps and bits of scientific and ethnographic archives around the world, from official government records and governors' diaries. And of course, none of these 18th and 19th century sources were born digital, but about 50% of them I have accessed in digital form. And I have found 100% of them using digitized catalogs and internet search engines. Shenandoah's life, however much she might have wished it otherwise, was entangled with the lives of white imperialist men. And the digitized archive has enabled me to track their movements around the increasingly networked colonial world and discover, with the help of other researchers who I mostly chat with online, these men's fascinating connections to other colonial histories. Even more importantly, digitization has enabled me to uncover the story of my own family in Newfoundland and learn more about the network of exploitation in which they were caught and sometimes from which they benefited. It was Ancestry.com where I found James Taverner, my first ancestor born on the island in 1635. And using the tools of the family history industry as it's known, I could reconstruct, with very few hours of research, comparatively speaking, 8 branches of my family tree going back more than 12 generations, all without leaving my desk. The project builds upon previous work by Ingeborg Marshall, who's still considered to be the historical authority on the Beothuk, and who just published a biography of William Epps Cormack in 2023 in her 93rd year. So she's now 95. Marshall's contribution to this history is immense, even if I don't agree with all of her conclusions. It's fascinating for me to be following in the footsteps of someone who worked a generation before me, particularly because she has just deposited her 50 years worth of research at Memorial University of Newfoundland's archive. And I've just had the pleasure of going through this a few weeks ago, box by box. They're so newly deposited that they've not yet been cataloged by the archivists there, but they let me see them because we're friends. It was a wonderful way to encounter them, so I encountered them just as she brought them there. And it made me think a great deal about digitization, chaos management, and how historians work, and how this has changed and not changed over time. So what I found was 20 boxes of meticulous research conducted between the early 1970s and the 2010s. Marshall usually started with letters, physical, handwritten, posted in the post letters, to archives and to individuals, inquiring after what materials they might hold. And some of these relationships, and I really think her methods, whether she would name them that way or not, were very feminist methods, because some of these relationships with archivists and personal and private families lasted for years. And so her letters would open by querying a husband's death or asking after a child's schooling or reporting about her own family holidays. And then after the long sort of like correspondence between friends, she would say, you haven't happened to find any more family papers, have you? And in one incredible moment on the trial of the only known full-scale Beothuk canoe that ever came into the hands of whites, Ingeborg traced it to the Earl of Bathurst, to whom it had been sent in the early 19th century by a Newfoundland governor as a gift, because that's what they did. And the next file in these boxes is her writing to the current Earl of Bathurst in the 1970s and asking whether he knew anything about this Beothuk canoe. He replies and says, no, I didn't. She replies back and says, well, could I possibly send some divers to search your lake? And then the next letter is her hiring the Gloucester Diving Club to go to the Earl of Bathurst's estate in Cirencester and try to find this canoe. They did not find the canoe. And then she starts going down another avenue of trying to figure out, like, how quickly does birch bark rot in water, would any remain, etc. And there's so much I recognize in this incredible research archive. The doggedness, the meticulousness, the detective work, the rabbit holes, the obsessions, the wanting to find something just for the sake of finding it. The research notes that she left behind also helped me to identify the places where certain mistakes and misconceptions in the history began. The way that the narratives were shaped and reshaped by new research and new researchers, and how two researchers, Marshall and I, can look at the same evidence and, because we're working in different intellectual contexts and because we're different human beings, come to fairly different conclusions. As amazingly helpful and inspiring as Marshall's research is, I'm of course also returning to the original sources that she used, and I'm searching for new ones. And one of the most striking differences between my work and Marshall's is that what took her weeks of correspondence or years of correspondence, even when letters became emails, I can get at the click of a few buttons without actually interacting with any human beings, without asking after anybody's children or talking about my vacation. What took her years of searching takes me hours. But in the end, for all my waxing lyrical about the power of digitization to tell small stories, I have a whole article about it, I have yet to find many sources that the indomitable Ingeborg Marshall hasn't already found using her painstaking letter writing method. But I have found a few, and one particularly important one. For decades, people have wondered about Ubi, the Beothic girl who's the only known Beothic person to have lived and died in England. And they've been searching to little avail. Nothing has been found for decades and decades. But thanks to digitization, I have found one more glimpse of her. If in Marshall, working without digital catalogs that are searchable by words as well as all words, as well as keywords, would likely never have found it, although if anyone could have found it, it would have been her. But because I can search every single digital archive catalog in the United Kingdom for terms, and I have, I'm pretty sure I have. I'm still working my way through, but I'm pretty sure I'm getting there. I did this, and I happened upon a series of letters in the Linnaean Society archive between an agent of Joseph Banks, the famed naturalist, and the man who took this young Beothic girl, Ubi, to Dorset, a merchant's agent by the name of Thomas Stone. In it, Banks's agent asks Mr. Stone to permit him to have Ubi's portrait painted. Banks had been to Newfoundland himself in the 1760s and always regretted not having found any Beothic. And so he considered Ubi, when he heard about her existence, to be this sort of long-sought specimen. Mr. Stone's reply, which came again through this agent, reveals significant information about Ubi's situation. Stone did not wish to send her to London to have her portrait painted because, quote, by sending her as a curiosity, she would in all probability meet with those indulgences which would not be compatible with her duties as a servant, from which state it is not at present likely she may be released. Stone went on to say that he'd be happy to take the Indian girl with him when he came to London in the winter, or if Mr. Banks would like to send a portrait artist to his home in Morden, Dorset, he would be happy to oblige. This digitally facilitated revelation matters immensely to me and the handful of others who work on the Beothic, and it's inspired me to keep searching for glimpses of Ubi. I've wandered around the muddy roads of tiny Morden in the rain. I've searched every parish register for Morden and neighboring parishes, both digitally and in person. I'm still searching for this portrait that may or may not have been painted or drawn or sketched. And these overlapping methodologies of digital searching and digital sources, of old-fashioned work in paper-based archives, of searching on Google Street View for the long-lost addresses, of wandering around villages in the rain just to put my body in the same physical space that my historical subject was once in, have become the fundamental pillars of my work, and I suspect many others' work as historians. And they range from the practical to the romantic, and like all the different versions of Shenandoah's drawings, Each one enriches the other. And there are other fundamental ways that digitization has changed the way we work as historians. The speed at which we can now find details doesn't just allow us to find people who we couldn't otherwise find or contextualize them in new ways. The savings on time means that I don't need to make this project my life's work. It has been taking a long time, and it's going to take longer. And because it's about my home and my family, I'm sure it's going to be probably the most important personal thing that I write. But I will not be working on this project as Marshall has for more than 50 years. So what does it mean now that we can so easily move from one project to another? Now that we can gobble up the past and spit out history? Not as fast as AI, and significantly better, but I think it does raise ethical questions. Why do we all assume that doing something faster or more efficiently or more comprehensively is better, when we must know in our hearts that that isn't always true? And like most ethical questions, they have no real answer other than to insist on the importance of asking them. After all, as Blake reminds us, a truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent. So, it's easy to justify my digital search for QUB in historical or historiographical terms. QUB is one of only 5 named Beothic individuals that we know about in history. And this is the first piece of new information we've had about any of those individuals in the last 2 decades. But my obsessive mixed methods quest for QUB is underwritten by what I confess is a much simpler motivation, and one that would make some historians, like Armitage and Goody, for instance, sneer. The truth is that I searched for her simply because somewhere in time, in this crazy network of happenings that have caused the present, there was a girl named QUB who witnessed the murder of her family when she was 9 years old, who was brought to Morden and Dorset, and who may or may not have had her portrait painted. So, in this concluding section of the talk, excellent, I'm on time, I want to bring us back to some of the questions I asked at the beginning. What do we do with all these small stories about digitization has helped us uncover in previously inconceivable numbers and details? How do we make sense of the chaotic past and its dizzying number of interrelations and possibilities that are visible today more than they ever have been? How can we make the most of the scraps that we find so quickly and so easily? And is AI the newest solution for managing the ever-living, ever-working chaos of being? So, the arrival of Einstein's theory of relativity in the early 20th century, argued Richard Evans, prompted some historians to think more about the contingencies and possibilities of the past. The first iteration of this thinking, known as counterfactual history, first appeared in the 1930s as a thought experiment that arose, unsurprisingly, as a shocked and decimated generation tried to understand how exactly they had gotten themselves into the First World War. Counterfactual history was popularized as a genre in the 1990s, and those of you who are my age and older will remember the series of what-if books that appeared in the history section of most major bookstores. And they were still bestsellers when I worked in a bookstore in the early 2000s. Like chaos theory history, but in a far more narrative form, these contributions considered, quote, slight turns of fate that had the potential to alter the course of human history. But its success mainly was within the popular history kind of world than within the academic realm. Most historians, amid the chaos and the counterfactuals, held with E.H. Carr, who dismissed discussions of the might-have-beens and what-if history as a parlor game. And yet, for the historians of the blacksmiths and the dirty nappies, the historians who write small stories, the might-have-beens of history are more than just a parlor game. They can provide a tangible and meaningful way to explore the lives of those who appear to us only as fragments, and who do not get to tell their own story in the library or the archive. As Natalie Zeman Davis put it, her work with the small and incomplete stories of individuals allows her, quote, to collect around my character things that are likely to have happened. small stories are, quote, a thought experiment in which the historian plays with, quote, a range of lived experiences and opens up choices along the way. These historians also work productively with absence and gaps and know that what is missing is a vital part of any story. And as a shorthand, I call this kind of history may-have history. And may-have history isn't new. The writing of small stories has always called into question the nature of historical evidence, our understanding of causation, and the role played by the individual in history. Blake suggests that fate is the organizing principle here. Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to endless night. But historians don't truck much with fate. And they have decided in the main that people make their own history, but not under conditions chosen by themselves. But throwing ourselves entirely behind these small stories leads us to a place that so bewildered Carlyle, that boundless and limitless space where millions of tiny heroes make their own history amid all the other random events in the natural world. And now that we have access to so many more of these small stories, how can we ever account for them all? Sophia Loriga, in her examination of the biographical method in history, discusses what she calls, quote, the utopian dead end of trying to tell everyone's stories. She cites the tale of the king, who sends his finest cartographers off to make the most accurate map of the world. And they return with a map the size of the world itself. And so I can see why, to some, small histories and may-have histories threaten the very fabric of what it is that historians do. May-have history also introduces a fundamental instability at the heart of historical knowledge that makes some people deeply uncomfortable. Reichman and Roth found the idea that a kingdom could be lost for the want of a nail ridiculous, not just because it was too small a historical variable, but because historians are profoundly aware of how many of these small variables are missing and will always be missing from the material that the past has left behind. We don't have the data to do these kinds of calculations. Carolyn Steedman writes about encountering, quote, the moment when history turns briefly, vertiginously into something else, reminding us that the reading and writing of it depends on the unsettling knowledge that nothing need have been said or written in the way that it has been. Nothing at all. And so in a world where we have access not only to more data, but also an even stronger understanding of how fundamentally imperfect that data is, perhaps it's not the metaphor of chaos that we need, but of quantum theory. So in Newtonian theory, or classical mechanics, there's only one history or trajectory, but not so in quantum theory. No matter how thoroughly and carefully we observe the present, the unobserved past and the future is indeterminate and exists only as a spectrum of possibilities. As the pioneering quantum physicist Richard Feynman put it, quote, a particle's actual trajectory is related to the sum of all its possible trajectories. And don't worry, I am not about to launch the new field of quantum history anytime soon. I simply say it because I think that it's actually a better metaphor for what most historians do with the chaos and fundamental uncertainties of the past. Or to put it another way, I may never know whether or not Ubi's portrait was actually painted. Sometimes the gone is just gone, or something never happened in the first place. But the possibility that it was painted matters, and exploring that possibility is important whether I ever find the actual portrait or not. Ultimately, I think may-have history opens up a space for hope in a world where generative AI is seen as a threat to the arts and humanities, a subject that I think we'll hear a lot more about tomorrow when an expert on the interface between AI and the humanities speaks. And I am definitely not an expert. But like everyone working in teaching in the discipline of history, I am affected by these new technologies and how they intersect with what it is I think I'm doing when I use new technologies to find and collate the material that the past has left behind and turn it into history. Is AI the next Cleometrics or Cultronomics or chaos theory? Or does it offer something fundamentally different to the historian's toolbox? Perhaps it depends on how you think about history. If, Like the proponents of cliometrics, culturenomics, and chaos theory, one believes history is scientific and can be modeled, then AI is probably going to be a good tool for that. It probably will eventually act as a relatively efficient deep reader and be able to identify and parse huge amounts of sources in new and clever ways. It will certainly help us get more comprehensive data sets. That is, if comprehensive data sets is what you're after. But if you think of history as a literature or as an art, then you might, as I am, be far from convinced. Ted Chiang, a science fiction and tech writer, argues that AI can never make real art because art is always a product of an immense series of human choices. He also argues that art, at its heart, is the product of an intention to communicate, an intention that AI simply does not have. And as historians know better than most, the data that's being used to train AI is not a normative thing that objectively reports on the chaos of the past and the present, but instead a historically contextual tidal wave of information that is infected with all the biases, flaws, and inconsistencies of humanity. Also, crucially, and I don't see this talked about near enough, AI only learns from that which we have digitized. And it's really, really interesting to talk to people who aren't historians or archivists and have them not realize this. You know, that the AI is not being trained on the breadth of human knowledge, past and present, it's being trained on what we've digitized. Nor is the AI deciding what it produces. That is the result of a prompt written by a human being and the material that it has specifically been trained on. This is why AI-generated historical images recycle so many stereotypes, why it produces images and accounts that are jarring and culturally inappropriate and anachronistic, why it can't tell the difference between the convincing and the uncanny, and why so much generative AI is so damn repetitive and dull. And of course, because AI's code is not visible to us, and most of us couldn't read it even if it was, we cannot see its neural processes. I cannot, like I could with Marshall's work, pinpoint when a myth or mistake gets introduced into the canon. I can't see the thinking evolve over time, and I can't see the forces that influence it. Perhaps most of all, and this is I think what I find the most interesting, is that AI can't seem to handle the missing, the things that are missing. When it encounters something that it doesn't know, it hallucinates. It often in really bizarro ways. It sort of makes things up in an extremely, what appears to us, very random way. And I think this inability to deal with the missing is one of the most interesting sort of aspects of it. Most of all, I know that lacking intent as it does, that AI did not search for the information because it is passionate about illuminating a particular history. And I'm not sure what to do with accounts that lack this underlying passion, because I could not understand or write history myself if I didn't feel it. And I'm sure that Ingeborg Marshall, as different from me as she is, would very much agree. So AI does not make choices the way humans make choices, and most of all, it doesn't know how to explain why those choices matter. For historians, deciding what matters and communicating that mattering is at the heart of how we manage the chaos of the past. And all of this makes me believe more than ever in the power of human storytelling as a mode of historical communication, and in the fundamental importance of the historian's choices in how they tell that story. So I'm not sure how to fight the historical deep fakes that generative AI is polluting the internet with, and then like recycling itself and then eating itself. It's all very confusing and disturbing. And I certainly don't think that there's any way to ban our students from using it. But I do think it's important to talk openly about these issues with our students and to explore in conversation with them the difference between AI painting American smiles on the faces of ancient indigenous people and soldiers and a historian's attempt to illuminate the life of a Beothic girl who may or may not have had her portrait painted. AI has the potential to generate really interesting conversations, in fact, about how we authenticate historical sources, about our assumptions, about universal human feelings, and how they can affect our interpretations of the past, about how history is a constant conversation and a form of intellectual training rather than just, and honestly, the exams are just as much to blame as AI is for this, just a litany of facts that you reproduce in an exam setting or in a term paper. It can help us talk to our students about the ethics of doing any of this in the first place. Or, as the editors of a recent roundtable on AI and the field of history, AI in the American Historical Review put it, quote, "To ponder the effects of artificial intelligence on the field of history quite often requires interrogating fundamental concepts such as truth, evidence, and authenticity." And the roundtable goes on to discuss the many ways that AI can be used in historical scholarship in helpful and productive ways. And the authors of these articles usefully remind us that the binary I cited just earlier of history as science and history as art is actually a false binary. So in conclusion, if I were to name the single most important thing that digitization has brought to my research, or the internet writ large, it wouldn't be the text searchable catalogs or the archive files at the click of a button. It would be, however, the conversations I've gotten to have with historians, archaeologists, heritage professionals, genealogists, teachers, artists, writers, and other historically minded folks online. The wealth of experience and expertise we have at our fingertips is incredible and reminds us that historians don't come to conclusions about what matters or craft important stories because we've mastered the art of parsing immense amounts of data and spitting out an answer. We come to conclusions by working and thinking and making choices together. And it's clear that we need to start collaborating more holistically with computer scientists and others in the tech and information sectors. Chaos management is a collective, polycentric, entangled, and ever-changing project. And if there's one thing that cliometrics, culturenomics, what-if historians, chaos theorists, neural network programmers, historical manifesto writers, quantum theorists, mayhem historians, and William Blake can all agree on, it's that everything is connected. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. So we've got time for questions. We don't have a roving mic, but I can kind of improvise one if we can't hear people. Does anyone want to start us off? Any initial questions? Well, I actually wanted to ask Julia what people are thinking. When we talk about this benefit of the digital space's communication, we seem to be in a transition space into where that communication happens with the decline of Twitter style social media's communication. Where is that conversation happening now?
I think it's still happening in the same place, right? But it's really interesting because you can sort of see, yeah, and we're all kind of fragmenting. I'm now experimenting with Blue Sky, but I'm still on Twitter. I'm one of those people. But it really, I think it's dramatically affected the conversations we're having in ways I don't think that we've reckoned with. Because that's the other thing, these things are happening in real time, right? They're changing all the time, especially Twitter. And so, I mean, the sense I get when I go on Twitter or Blue Sky is that people are bereft, actually. And that these networks aren't just intellectual networks, they're also activist networks. And they're being disrupted. But it's all part of a wider story, right, of the privatization of the internet, which started as a very utopian vision of a free society where information and communication was free and accessible to all, right? That was sort of the dream, and now it has very, very, very much come crashing down. And I'm definitely not the one to try to prescribe a solution. I only identify problems.
Julia, fascinating talk. And one of the things that you brought out was how historians appreciate and can deal with the missing, the gaps in history. The recent series of British public inquiries show how politicians are actively trying to increase that gap, the missing, where post-its disappear off, WhatsApp conversations are deleted. Have you any suggestions for future historians
I got myself into this, didn't I? I got myself into these big questions by putting out these really big thoughts. I don't know. I don't know if there's any much we can do. I mean, there are laws that should prevent the destruction of this information. The rule of law has not been particularly strong in the UK over the last couple decades, so maybe things will get a little better. But it's interesting. So for a lot of my previous work, I dealt with a lot of material written by civil servants in the early 20th century. And it doesn't take long to become really profoundly aware of all the things that, the tiers of information, right? There's the officially written down and communicated to the Home Office from the Metropolitan Police, say, right? Like there's that correspondence. And then there's the correspondence that the police have amongst themselves, which doesn't always go to the Home Office. And then there's the most important stuff of all, which is the stuff the police and the Home Office say and do in the hallways, and the streets, that never ever gets written down. And I think historians are so profoundly aware of that, right? And so we're not surprised when we hear about governments and other, authorities doing it in the present. And perhaps, all we can really do is constantly remind people that this is happening, that this has happened, and that, again, this sort of idea that we could access the data from the past is an absolute delusion, right? And it isn't just delusional and silly, it's dangerous. So yeah, I guess that's my sort of answer.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thanks so much for the talk. It was really, really fascinating. I just wondered from the other side, that Marshall, do you know, how's she viewing did she know you were going to her papers? Do you have any idea what she thinks of your methods?
Yes, very much so. I've had the privilege of having many, many, many long conversations with her and her nursing home in St. John's. There's things we really disagree on in terms of what the sources say, but she's actually fascinated and really excited by the stuff that I'm finding. So every time I find anything new, I email it directly to her. She gets her son to print it out, and then she puts it in her files that she's still keeping at the age of 95. I mean, she's very frail, as you might imagine. But very, very, maybe one of the reasons she made it to 95 is because she's still actively thinking about how research changes and how new material can be found. So I expected perhaps some territoriality or something like that, but I've not encountered any of that. It helps that I'm a woman because she had a lot of really negative run-ins with male historians and archaeologists in her career who dismissed her and didn't take her seriously. So I think mostly she's just really happy that I am taking her seriously and that the work is going to continue on. But yeah, we email back and forth all the time. So yeah, it's a happy ending in that way, because it could have been different.
Thanks for this. This is really fascinating. So I'm an outsider.
It's okay.
But I guess I was curious to hear you say a bit more. So the concept of chaos management, which is the red thread through what you're doing. I mean, so it seems as if there's at least sort of two different things that could be, and maybe they're in tension. So one of them is there's the chaos management of just there's so much information, I like literally unimaginable amount of information, and then beyond that is the unimaginable reality that this information imperfectly represents the best. And so there's the chaos management of just sort of wanting to know what happened, which is sort of desire to sort of know what is most important, have some sort of narrative that helps orientate you. But then there's also, which you touched on as well, the kind of need, is there's a sort of psychological or emotional need, which is just the sort of, like too much information is bad for you, you want to sort of fend it off. And I think there's versions of this that seem very relatable. I mean, at the risk of sort of, so like Israel-Palestine, right? This is a thing that I know very little about, but I know enough about to say that there just seems to be so many competing narratives, and you get there's so much information about it, so much history, that on the one hand, you kind of just want to sort of tell about it, so you can have an opinion, you kind of shape the role it's in, because it seems important, but at the same time, it matters if it's true or not, right? So you can sort of see that these two things can kind of pull in different directions, and I guess I just sort of
I think you've summarized that tension really, really nicely, actually, that I was trying to communicate. And it ranges from the emotional to the practical. You know, I talk to my students about both the emotional resonances of the research, and also I proselytize about Microsoft OneNote as a data management software, right? It's everything. But like what you said about, you know, the news and people's access to information, I was really interested during COVID because I've got a lot of friends in Newfoundland and a lot of friends, obviously, in England on social media. And technically, we all, at that moment, had access to all the same information. But I would be sitting in England and, you know, the sky would be falling and the schools are shutting and everyone's freaking out, myself included. And back in Newfoundland, everyone was still like, oh, this COVID thing, I wonder, you know, it's looking worrying. And it just made me so aware that no matter how much information that we have access to, that we're always, that people both want to consume as much information about something very important as they can, but also don't quite understand it until it's on their doorstep. It's an interesting thing about people that can be negative and positive, I think, at the same time.
Well, I suppose the question then would be, is there, in your, with your expertise, I mean, you know, what are those sorts of principled way of managing that kind of thing? Because, you know, I mean, obviously the danger, it would seem, again, from an outsider's point of view, it seems like the danger is inherent in stuff like microhistory is just, it's sort of like the danger of just using emotion, using stories sheerly for the purpose of emotional regulation, right? You know, like just because it's just nicer to have that shape. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, that just sort of seems like it obviously causes problems that maybe are more apparent when it's topical issues, but they're still there.
Oh yeah, they're still there. I mean, history is always a topical issue, says the historian. But yeah, I think historical storytelling at its best doesn't do that, right? It doesn't just tell a story for emotional management. It does it all. And that's what I kind of developed in my article, is that digitization allows us to toggle and to sort of tell a story while also connecting that story in very carefully evidenced ways, because that's the other thing historians love, is evidence. And in crafting that in a way that's both big and small at the same time. And I think it's why I love history. It can do that, I think, better than any other form of communication.
Any more questions?
Sorry, can I just ask what I hope is on everyone else's mind as well, but can you expand on your vampire thesis?
Oh, so, I'm going to be careful. I'm pretty sure the non-disclosure agreement is expired because it was a long time ago. But there's this running theme in video games and film, and actually, and comic books, that the victims of Jack the Ripper were actually vampires. So speaking of things that do not exist, there was going to be a video game where one played as Jack the Ripper, but one was not bad. One was a hero, because Jack the Ripper wasn't killing women, he was killing succubi. Yeah. And this sort of motif has completely, it's infected the internet to the extent that AI is deciding that Victorian prostitutes look like vampires. And I just think it's a really good example, right, of how this is not a kind of pure parsing of evidenced information. This is a kind of fever dream. And the sort of weight of historical gaming online specifically skews the AI to create a portrait. But I mean, it also says something about neural networks. I have several friends who are very high up in terms of neural network programming, and I try, every now and then I sit them down and I'm like, please explain it to me again. And I still don't get it. But one of the things about it is that the historian, Carla, who put this prompt in, told the AI what the name of the pub was, but the AI could not manage to write it on the sign and yet put vampire teeth on these women. It's just fascinating. But yeah, that's why. That's my theory, is this motif that started, I guess, around in the 1990s, but really peaked in the 2000s, of the prostitute as vampire, and specifically the victims of Jack the Ripper as vampires. Yeah.
Any more questions? the dynamic between you and this historian, Marsh, and I want to ask, do you trust her dive team, or do you want to hire your own?
I don't know, that was 1977, so that canoe's got to be gone at this point.
There's like there's underwater imaging technology, so you can say
It's
actually
true.
part of the-
It's interesting though, because that's the difference between she and I. She started to move in the kind of second half of her career, especially into archaeology more, and she's and still is much more interested in kind of the technical history of the Beothics. So where they came from as a people before they migrated to Newfoundland, why their canoe is the shape it is, the meaning of their quite enigmatic carvings that they produced in great numbers, those sorts of things, which of course interest me. But it's not, I'm just not asking those questions. So finding the canoe for me is not that important. What's significantly more important is visiting, as I do, Shenandoah's model canoe, which sits in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, in the Atlantic Gallery. So you can all go see it if you want, and it's beautiful. And unlike so much Indigenous artwork, it's actually attributed to her. So I spoke to the curator who saw to that, and she said the reason why I put it in Pride of Place is because I noticed that it had this woman's name on it, and you usually don't know who made these things. So yes, please do go visit it or look online. There's beautiful pictures online. The Beothic canoe was really uniquely shaped, kind of unique in all of North America, actually. And Shenandoah made one when she was held captive in a white settlement. So yeah, that's the canoe I care about.
Okay.
The canoe under the water, maybe, I don't know.
I think that's a good place to finish, because I think that your ability to garner insight from my silly question is a sort of perfect example of your method. So to finish up, just to thank Julia again for a really insightful talk, and thank you all for coming as well.
Thank you.
And just to remind you that the conference is also all day tomorrow, and everyone's welcome to come. It's free to attend. We also have an exciting panel at the Seamus Heaney Centre tomorrow evening on history and video games, and possibly some vampiric links.
We'll see.
Who knows? So yeah, so that's all